Hi, good evening, good morning, good afternoon to our global conversation and an audience from 65 countries, I hear, Kazakhstan, Peru, Samoa, Hong Kong, as well as UAE and the USE and France and my native United Kingdom. I'm Emily Casrell. I'm head of special projects at the BBC World Service. I used to edit the arts output at the World Service and led Crossing Divides, a pan-BBC season challenging polarization and division. And it's so fantastic to have you join us at this really interactive session where together we're going to be exploring ways to increase diversity and inclusion. As after all, the theme of the symposium is reframing museums, and we've got some outstanding panelists. Now, as you've heard in other sessions, when the symposium was first being dreamt of, no one really expected, of course, that we would be in the midst of a global pandemic. So I really want to know what you think. So we're going to have a little poll just to kick us off with. Do you think that COVID-19 is more of an opportunity or a threat for museums in their journey to become more diverse and inclusive? So obviously it's both, but where do you feel the balance lies? Opportunity or threat? And we're going to be using your judgment to kick off a discussion about this after we do our introductions. So really delighted to be welcoming you to our discussion. And of course, this is an extraordinary, challenging time for museums. Shutdowns across the globe, financial pressures as traditional funders tighten their purse strings. And of course, more calls to be more ethical, more representative, more inclusive. And some people think that museums are symbols, they're part of an out-of-touch elite. Now, Darren Walker, the president of the Ford Foundation, has said, art needs to be more focused on access, opportunity, fairness, dignity, and openness. And I think and I hope that the next 2 hours are going to be so engaging. The only reason you're going to pick up your phone is to tweet using the hashtag #ReframingMuseums. First of all, just a very big thank you to our hosts for organising the symposium. Mariette Webster-Mann, the Vice Chancellor of NYU Abu Dhabi, and Manuel Rabate, the Director of the Louvre Abu Dhabi. So I'm going to be introducing our panelists. Now, I know it's so tough that we can't all be in the same room together today, but I have to say one of the rewards is getting such a brilliant, high caliber panelist here to discuss this important issue. And I always think it's kind of more fun when we get to know the panelists personally, their personal passions. So as I introduce each one of you in turn, I'm going to ask you to describe with an image a piece of art that is really inclusive and that means a lot to you, means the most to you personally. Now, only giving you a minute and just a bit of fun at the top of this. There's going to be a gong in the hands of our curator, Anis Aguer, to make sure you keep to your minute. So if you're ready, I'm going to kick off with you, Kaywin Feldman. And you are a pioneer in multiple ways. You're the first female director of the National Gallery of Art in Washington, USA. You have a background in classical archaeology and adventures in North Africa and Europe. Groundbreaking leadership you showed at the Minneapolis Institute of Art, where you created a center there of empathy in the visual arts, exploring the role that arts can play, enabling us to reach out and understand difference. You've also been called an enemy of art in your desire to create a more inclusive museums. And you have said, our past does not have to be our destiny. So we've got this piece of art here. Can you tell us more about it and why you've chosen to share it with us for this discussion today, Kaywin?
Yes, thank you, Emily. I chose this painting by Martin Wong because it radiates optimism for our future. Titled Polaris, it was painted by Wong in 1987 as the AIDS crisis was ravaging people around the world. Here we see 8 diverse children playing marbles. They're seated on a large map of the night sky with Polaris, the North Star, in the center. As a leader, I must remain hopeful. The challenge is balancing a skeptically realistic point of view with an optimistic perspective for our staff during this time of emotional and mental strain. Things really are terrible, and yes, we will get through it. Empathy for others is part of my own internal North Star. The 8 diverse children seated in a circle on Wong's canvas look like America today, a country in which the majority of people 16 years old and younger are people of color. In just 20 years, the majority of all Americans will be people of color. I believe in this diverse generation of 16-year-olds, but we need to give them some help by taking better care of our planet and of people who suffer misfortune and are treated unjustly.
Thank you so much, Kaywin. You did that in 1 minute. And what a beautiful image to kick us off with, an optimistic image of all our communal future, not only on earth, but in the heavens above. That's really beautiful. Thank you, Kaywin. So I'm going to turn now to Ama Eswagala. You're really passionate, I understand, about the role of art and culture in broader development. You're a really significant international convener across the globe in your role as chair of the Inclusive Museum Network and the founding director of the International Institute for the Inclusive Museum. Bang on topic. You're professor at multitude of universities in Holland, in Australia, and many in your native India. You've written a lot of books, including World Heritage, Benefit Beyond Borders, exploring the benefit of culture to local communities and ecosystems. But I should say, you're not just an academic, if being an academic isn't enough, you're also a practitioner. You've been chief curator at the Amaravati Heritage Town, the birthplace of Mahayana Buddhism in India. So tell us about your chosen piece that you want to share with us and why.
Thank you, Emily. When I came back to India after 43 years in Australia and other countries, I went straight to my birthplace, and this is Amaravati, the birthplace of Mahayana Buddhism. And what I found not only there, but elsewhere in India is that most museums, in fact, almost all of them represent the urban elites. And it's a conversation among, 2 to 3% of people in the cities. And that nearly 80%, this is Gandhi's villages of India, are totally forgotten, not represented in the museums of India. So going back to a village, a small village, what I also found is that like elsewhere in India, men are everywhere in museums. Women rarely feature, whether in exhibitions, whether in the narratives, whether in the discourse, or the display, or the exhibitions. So I kickstarted a project with daughters-in-law of the village. These are all the daughters-in-law that you see in the image. In this village, women marry and they go to another village. It's exogamous marriage. But women from other villages marry and come to this village. So all these women have come from other villages to live here. So I started a project called Mavuru Ma Kodalu, that means our village, our daughters-in-law. It's got multiple dimensions to this project. And what you're seeing over here is rehabilitation, a community space that women always came to, which got marginalized over centuries, perhaps, and how they've reclaimed it. But at the same time, that gender of that binary of male, female, or third gender doesn't exist in the village. So what you got at the bottom is they're bringing together the intangible heritage that is associated with this space. The women brought them to come and perform as part of their ceremony. So I thought inclusion in India is really bringing the villages together with the rest of India and women together with the rest of India.
Thank you so much, Ama Eswa. What a beautiful story of inclusion, of gender, of diversity, and of daughters-in-law, such an important partner role in society, as well, of course, of villages. Thank you for that. Laurent Descartes, I'm going to introduce you now. For the last 3 years, you've been president of Musée d'Orsay, one of my personal favorites, and the Musée d'Orangerie. You're the first woman, and it's quite incredible that you are the first woman, to lead a major national museum in France. And before that, you helped set up the Louvre's first international output in Abu Dhabi. and you're always pushing frontiers. You have a deep expertise in late 19th century and early 20th century art, and you put on the exhibition, Le Modèle Noir, the Black Model, the first exhibition by a major French art institution tackling the topic of representation of Black people in art. So what's your chosen piece to share with us and why?
Hello, Emily. Hello to everyone. I precisely chose a work of art that was linked to the Black Model exhibition last year in Musée d'Orsay. What you see is Glenn Ligon's Some Black Parisians installation in the central nave of the museum in the wake of the Black Model exhibition. The work, as you can see, consisted of 12 large-scale neons which highlighted the names of some of the models, performers, and writers who appear in important French works of art from the 19th and early 20th centuries. While some of them are well known to the general public, some of us remain relatively obscure. Some Black Parisian is an attempt to address the highly visible invisibility in the fate of many Black figures in French art. By placing them up in lights, it signals the importance and legitimacy of these Black Parisian in the history of art. And this is precisely one of the challenges, I think, of a museum today, is to change the way, to find new angles, new ways of looking at works of art, which sometimes we are very familiar to, works of art coming from the past, masterpieces of some of our museum, and trying to make them accessible to all audiences. And it's exactly what the work also of Glenn was about, was putting all those names inside at the heart of a museum and making new audiences come to Orsay and discover a heritage that is also common to all our visitors.
Fantastic, thank you so much. Really beautiful ideas about visibility and invisibility and legibility and new ways to make the familiar engaging for a new audience. Thank you.
Absolutely. There is a video, I think, because I see that on my screen right now, of the installation. Well, really, you will see Glenn working in Orsay. We can go ahead, yeah.
Thank you so much. I love the unknown name is included amongst all the names. We'll be talking about names later. So thank you. Let me turn to Adriano Pedroso. You're the lead at the Musée d'Art de São Paulo, MASP. It's in one of the busiest streets in São Paulo, in the financial district, a street which has also been the backdrop for decades of protests. And in fact, you have been called revolutionary, because you've got this idea to invite all kinds of Brazilians to enter the museum and recognize themselves there. And the idea really is to change the whole identity of the museum. And before that, you organized a seminal exhibition about the history of Brazil. And it was far more than a single story about and by privileged, wealthy white men. And I see you've got lots of exciting things up ahead, exhibitions on sexual diversity, delirious histories. So tell us about your chosen piece to share with us and why.
Hello, thank you, Emily. Thank you, everybody. What we're looking at here is a work by a collective of artists, Afro-Brazilian artists. What you're reading is a banner. It says, "Onde estão os negros? Where are the blacks?" This work was installed on the facade of our building during the exhibition Afro-Atlantic Histories that we hosted in 2018. And since then, the work, in fact, came into the collection. So we have the banner and we have also documentation and photography on it. As you said, this is one of the most iconic and busiest streets in São Paulo, where the museum rests. The sentence itself is quite a provocation. The sentence is a quotation from something that Jean-Paul Sartre, the French author, said when he visited Brazil in 1960. Brazil is very well known for its Black, quite diverse population. We received about 40% of the Africans coming through the Americas in the slave trade. Through many centuries, Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery. And asking this, where are the Blacks? In a museum that's well known for its European collections, it's also asking where are the representations of Black people in the collection, in staff, in our board itself, and things that we have tried to address quite significantly since then, since 2018, but there's still much work to be done, of course. The work is never really done, no?
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Adriano. It's so interesting that the piece of work is outside and then it's become inside, both in its invocation for your behavior as a museum, but also as a piece of work, making that transition from outside to inside and in a way being symbolic of the people who've been excluded and then can be welcomed into the museum space. Thank you so much for that. Manal Ataya, let me introduce you. You're Director General of the Sharjah Museum Authority in UAE, and you oversee 16 museums across the Sharjah. It's got a really wide remit under you. You've got Islamic culture and history, contemporary art, heritage, maritime history, archaeology, science, and kids learning. Wow, what a lot. And in fact, impact is really at the core of many of your activities. I was reading about an aquarium festival that you put on, focusing on the environment and ecological issues, in which you exhibited artwork made from trash that had been salvaged from the sea. And in an op-ed that you recently wrote about museums, you said, it's important to be uncomfortable because it can signal a need to change, to rethink and to unlearn biases, those that we know to be wrong. So tell us about your chosen piece of work, Manal.
Thank you, Emily. The work I've chosen is by the artist Irvan Demirjian. It is hanging at the moment in the Sharjah Art Museum. It's part of the Barjeel Art Collection. What I loved about this piece is because I feel it talks to or speaks to, let's say, the idea of inclusiveness in two ways. One from the artists themselves and also by the subject matter. So the artist is Armenian Egyptian, was born in Constantinople at the time of the Ottoman Empire, but due to persecution, later had to leave to Egypt and became as a refugee. So he understood this idea of displacement, understanding persecution of minority groups. And then here in this image, which is very rare, you don't normally find depictions of dark-skinned, let's say Black women, in images especially portrayed in this way. They're often secondary to the central figure in an image, or they're depicted as slaves or something else. But here you see a very graceful, strong, dignified woman, and he's also called it Nubian. And I think this is very important because he's trying to symbolize or signal as well that the Nubian people are indigenous ethnic minority to Egypt. You can see the pyramid in the background behind her face. I think, again, this is symbolic of what is really Egypt, who are really Egyptians, and himself becoming, Egyptian himself after living there for many years, but being of an ethnic minority of Armenians. I think he had this great sensitivity to this idea of ethnic origins and ethnicities that make up different countries, but often are ignored, sometimes displaced forcibly, etc. And sadly, in this case, the Nubian people, as of the early 1900s, were displaced after the dams were beginning to be built by the political parties at that time. So they were forcibly displaced up until the 1950s, etc. So now, Nubian culture, Nubian language, is forgotten to a certain extent. And I think this is a really great image that talks about how otherization is really a global experience.
Thank you so much, Manal. It's such a beautiful image, isn't it? It's so both reflecting the outside, but also reflecting an internal world, and one to sort of focus on displacement and persecution and minorities. It's really, I'm very drawn to it. It looks quite extraordinary. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I'd like to introduce Salah Hassan. You are Professor of African and African Diaspora Art and History and Visual Culture, that's quite a mouthful, at Cornell University in America. And I know that you're particularly interested in the question of African identity and African and other diaspora identities. I hear that you're currently working on two major projects, the Egyptian Surrealists and the Making of Modern Art Movement in Sudan. And one area that you're particularly passionate about is highlighting artists who've been silenced and overlooked by the mainstream art world. So tell us about your chosen piece of work and why. Hi, Salah. Salah, do we have your audio working?
I unmuted myself. Thank you so much, Emily, and thanks to everyone who worked behind the scene and those who invited me for this great conference. I just want to add one thing is that I'm currently the director of the Africa Institute in Sharjah. So that's important to mention. And I'm based in Sharjah on leave from Cornell. The work that I chose is actually deliberate, but it's very specific to the Euro-American context. It is the work by the African-American conceptualist, David Hammons, and it's titled Untitled, African-American Flag. It is between 1990 and then 2004 because the work itself has so many lives. The reason I chose it is because it's simply witty and brilliant, like all the works of David Hammons. And the work actually, rather than representing inclusion, it rather represents and as well respond to the tension between inclusion and exclusion in relation to issues of racial justice, inequality, and representation of African American. It also, because it plays on the tension between familiarity and unfamiliarity, it looks familiar because it represents the American flag, which is supposed to be in red, blue, and white, yet it's rendered in the red, black, and green, which is the colors of the Black Pan-Africanism or Black nationalism. It also references a major existential question that haunted the Black subject in the US, and that is represented by what W.E.B. Du Bois called the issue of the color line and the double consciousness between being an African, not fully so, but being an American, but not fully accepted as though. It also reminds me of what James Baldwin said at the shock of discovering at age 5th or 6th or 7th, to discover that the flag, as he said, to which you have pledged allegiance along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. So it comes as a great shock to him, of course, at that time. It also takes a different life when it's adopted by the Black Lives Movement. And also the whole issue of the flag comes out of play since the Colin Kaepernick, the football player, took the knee. So if we may go through the slides, I will discover this idea of how the work itself in different contexts plays different roles. The second slide here, you could see clearly, it's in context of MoMA and shown in comparison to Jasper Jones' flag, which is a bit ambiguous, unlike the wittiness of the MoMA. With the David Hammons' flag. The second scene that you see is hanging outside the Studio Museum in Harlem, which almost becomes like a site-specific in being adopted almost like a flag. And then finally, there is the edition of it from last year, which is titled by the artist himself, "Oh Say, Can You See?" Of course, this is reference the first stanza of the US national anthem, and which also people sometimes forget that the national anthem, the original lyrics are very much racist, in which it says that no refuge could save the hirelings and the slave from the terror of flight, of the gloom of the grave. And finally, of course, the last image, if I may have it on the screen, it shows the flag as it is adopted, consciously or unconsciously. I think frankly, the artist himself wouldn't care. It is adopted by the Black Lives Matter movement, and it became almost like their flag. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manal. And I have to say that Anais didn't get a chance to sound her gong, as all you guys were so fantastic on timing. But what a beautiful and interesting piece of work to end. And I like the fact that it's witty and it's gone through these different transformations and it's provocative, and it belies the tension between being inclusive and being exclusive and the familiar and unfamiliar. There's such all really, really interesting pieces of work, which is not surprising given the caliber of you guys, our panelists. Now, I'm delighted to be able to share with you the results of the poll. So what do you think? More of an opportunity or more of a threat? As you can see, the poll results there, we have 78% saying that it's an opportunity and only 22% seeing it as more of a threat. I should say more or less, because I think everybody will agree it is both. And it's delighted that there's so much optimism despite the challenges that we have in front of us. So I'm interested in hearing from you guys, our panelists here, because of hyperlocalism and frontiers closing down and a sort of world appearing scary and uncertain, sometimes we therefore prioritize our family and those we care about the most. In that sort of context, how can we bring the radical changes that are needed in order to make museums more diverse and inclusive? And I want to kick off first with you, Omar Eswa, because I know you've done some thinking about the idea of this pandemic that we're all grappling with in different ways, being a portal and forcing us to rethink and reboot everything that we're doing. I can't hear you, you're still on mute.
Thanks, Emily. The photograph that you saw that I showed, they all are women beautifully dressed, but what you see is without the patriarchy, the guardians of patriarchy there, the young women mix irrespective of their caste background. Quite a few of the women come from the so-called Dalit background, or so-called untouchable, Dalit background. And but you can't tell that kind of matrix that's there. I think that, why I think this is a great opportunity is everybody, I think most people in museums have heard of Mandela. And when I was working in South Africa, when he was the president for the 5 years, what hit me is very strongly, and in fact, that's what helped me to formulate what in establishing the Institute for Inclusive Museum, is that in the early 1960s, when he was committed for treason, in the interview, he says, South Africa is for all South Africans. Then on the 10th of May, 1994, when he was inaugurated, remember he was elected on 27th of April, but inaugurated on the 10th of May, 1994 in the Union Square in Pretoria as the president of Free Democratic Republic of South Africa. He gives this amazing speech and he finishes it off by saying, and thunders across the Union Square, let there be water, let there be land, and let there be salt for all people of South Africa. So, and then this is embedded in the Reconstruction and Development Plan, that development and transformation is for all South Africans.
And I'm wondering about this development and transformative opportunity, the one we're engaging with now, particularly around the epidemic. And I know Laurence and Kaywin and Manal, all of you who are working, in charge of museums themselves, and Adriano, of course, too. How are you making sense of utilizing this unique opportunity of change and rethinking in terms of addressing your own museums? And is it really an opportunity? I mean, let's be real here and be authentic and talk honestly here. Which of you would like to contribute? You're smiling, Laurence. Would you like to say something?
Kaywin as
Please go on.
You kick off and then Kaywin will join in.
Let's be a bit honest there. It's a tremendous shock to the cultural world, and it's not fun every day, and some institutions are really in a perilous moment. And I'm not really talking about France. France has, as you know, a Minister of Culture, and I am the president of 2 museums that are state-owned and greatly, partly state-funded. So I don't have to fire anyone. You know, all the staff will stay the same. We are sticking to the exhibition programs. We can do, you know, we can move ahead with our projects. So we are in a very secure position compared to many other institutions. But I am giving the European point of view. This is a very tough crisis, and a very tough crisis for the performing arts world, for instance, music, theater. You know, this is really tough. So yes, of course, as all crises, there are moments of opportunities for change, and this is the mother of all crises. So we have a big opportunity, obviously, but. You know, it's more it's more putting the stress on things that have been all around, and that we have been working on, you know, from sometimes many years. Things are accelerating. A crisis is always a moment where things accelerate, and they do accelerate. The digital question is, of course, one of the key questions right now, and not an easy one to solve for any museum by any standard. And the connection to the public is essential, because when we open again, and this is the second time in the year that I close my museums, and we are preparing for the second reopening, probably in December. So every time you have to relaunch the interest for the museum, what it does, what it means. But again, I think that there is a sense right now that culture is extremely important, and culture is just a priority in our lives. At least in Paris, I can tell you, this is the world that is, you know, all around, and it's putting a lot of pressure on our political, you know, staff to reopen as soon as possible the world of culture.
Thank you so much, Laurence, and it's such an important time, but I want to focus particularly on the impact of the epidemic in terms of the journey that museums are taking to become more diverse and inclusive, and to what extent we can use it as an opportunity to further that agenda. Kewin, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I do think that just the question as it was phrased is unfortunate, because there is no way to characterize the pandemic as an opportunity, given the effect that it's had on individuals. You know, almost 250,000 people in the United States have died. And as it particularly refers to the point you just made, here in America, the greatest impact of COVID has been felt by our people living on the margins, by our low-income citizens, and most especially by people of color in the United States. So when it comes to a journey of diversity, we're seeing the very real suffering of our community members who are people of color. And then, of course, in museums, it tends to be that our frontline workers, the ones who are taking tickets every day, and our security guards are very often also people of color. And while a lot of our curators and administrators are white and sitting at home and working at home, while our frontline staff. So I think there really is not a way to say that it's an opportunity. I think that it's on us as things move forward to take the very best of our institutions from the pre-COVID world into whatever becomes our new normal, and leave behind other factors. But I think it's just important to rephrase that question, perhaps.
Thank you, Kewin, for that really important and absolutely useful corrective. So I'm very, very grateful. Any more quick thoughts on this from you, Adriano or Manal, about the way that you yourself, how, you know, there's been such disruption to museums and, of course, to so many individuals whose lives have been lost and been badly affected. But in terms of your journeys towards more inclusivity in your museums, what's going on?
So, if I may, I would say that already we were on this track. In 2017, we revised the mission of the museum, and the very first sentence of our new mission defines the museum as a diverse, inclusive, and plural institution. So this really gives us the mandate and the opportunity to explore diversity and inclusion in the program, in the collection, in many different what we call mediation programs, even in social media, because we were closed here for over 7 months during the whole sort of summer period in the Northern Hemisphere. We were closed and we opened about 45 days ago. I would say the opportunity, of course, now is more related to the Black Lives Matter movement rather than the pandemic itself. Of course, there is a connection between the two, but I think the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, in a global scale, gave us the opportunity to think through, you know, different possibilities that we could increase diversity and inclusion and plurality. I see that as an opportunity itself. And as I said, the work is never really done. You know, we might have curators, we might have artists, we might have works, you know, representing Black characters and made by Black artists, but we're still a long way to go when you think about the directors, when we think about the board, the trustees and all that. So the work is never really done, no? And it becomes more and more pressing, I think, as we move forward, no?
Thank you, Adriano. And I saw, Salah, that you put your hand up earlier.
What I was actually going to say, and agreeing with Feldman, is that the issue is really not COVID. What pandemics come and go, and humanity will survive somehow, and at a great cost in the context of COVID, of course. The issue is what COVID has exposed, which is the inequality in all spheres. And this is clear even prior to that, but it just exploded and brought it to the fore. And it also exposed what we know now as the afterlife of colonialism or settler colonialism. That is what Aníbal Quijano, the Peruvian scholar, would say, the coloniality of being, that is slavery, racialization, otherization, caste system, and so forth, brought to the fore in the context of the post-pandemic. And also, in relation to something else that we should tie to COVID, because it is the anti-racist, is the protest movement that's associated with anti-Black racism, especially the brutal killing of George Floyd. So I think for me as an art historian, it also exposed something else, the problematic of the Eurocentric paradigms of the disciplines such as art history and visual culture, which privileges the West. It makes every other culture, even in the context of modernity or contemporaneity, as a derivative of it. So that is one. But it's also, I look at it not as a challenge or the other aspect of the reverse of challenge or an opportunity. I look at it as bringing that tension to the floor. For example, collections in Western museums. The issue of reparation and restitutions becomes central. Prior to that, of course, there was the Macron report, which has its own problematic, but it made museums now started to think very, openly about what to do with those objects, what to do with representation of minorities, gender issues, and all of those things. And I think this is what we really should focus on, is that what it brought in the context of these challenges or in the context of these opportunities.
Thank you. Really interesting thoughts from you there, Saleh. And Manal, do you want to come in here?
Yes, thank you. I think there's a number of issues. I completely agree with Dr. Salah. I was about to say that I saw the whole thing with, or I see everything now with the pandemic, not so much an opportunity, so to speak, but it really shook everything. It kind of, woke us up a little bit to what was going on in many different areas. There's the very, let's say, simplistic ways to look at inclusion. So people were looking at it as, okay, let's put things online, let's go digital. And in a way that was very telling, because some people, it took them a week to put things online, and they hadn't done that for some of the institutions for 100 years. So if it was only it only took you a week to do that. Why hadn't you done it before? So for some people, it wasn't funds or resources. It was really just having that complete, ignorance, I think, about why or the need for opening up collections and opening up information to other people. But then again, these are all one-sided, right? Having a website open or having social media presence is still a one-sided interaction. It's not actual digital engagement. And I think this is an area that we will have to really understand and unpack further over the coming years and get the real experts in there to understand how this will really work. If, yes, museums will not open for a while, what does a museum mean if it can't be open? What is an exhibition if it's not the usual 2-year planning of an exhibition to be seen physically, but rather digitally? On the other aspect, which Dr. Salah mentioned, is at the same time, we've been going through these unbelievable social political shifts at the same time in the world, in the museum world, looking at restitution, looking at, democratizing the collections, decolonizing narratives and collections. And I think, this is also part of our thinking about how, in a way, they work together, because the digital solution, if you want to call it, could help in that respect to some degree. But what more we know about that is there to tell. But I think it starts with self introspection. And I think this is an opportunity in that sense for all of us working in the field to think about how, decolonize our own thoughts, right? What are we thinking of, or what are our own paradigms that we need to change? And I do think that it's not just for us to do, but it's also part of civil society and collectives to play into this. So it's going to be, I hope, a much more expansive solution to a lot of these issues to start to tackle them.
So fantastic you brought that up, Manal, this idea of an expansive solution that we can all be involved in, because I think sometimes the whole question about the changes that are needed, it can look in quite a binary way. Are you for or against this journey? But of course, it's important, as you're saying, to have introspection, not just to condemn and criticize, but to realize that we all can be part of a solution. And indeed, we want this discussion to inspire action and positive change. And I know we've got this international audience here full of people who work in the museum sector, who are studying, and others who are really engaged and interested. So I'm hoping that for the rest of our discussion, you can think personally what you, the audience, feel you can do to realize your power and make a difference and contribution. And I'm hoping that in our discussion that we've got left, we're going to really focus on some solutions and make you think about what you might do in the institution that you're involved in, or you work in, or you have some influence about what you can really do to make some of these big changes that need to be made to decolonize museums, to use Salah, a phrase that you and indeed sort of using the pandemic, the opportunity to wake us all up and to become, to think about our own actions and our own language and our own ways that we work. So if you have a think about that, audience is over here, I'm sorry I can't see you, but I'm hoping that you can have a think. And if you then want to share your thoughts in the chat, and as you're sharing your thoughts, put a capital yes, Y-E-S, if you want to share them and then take part in the discussion with your voice and with your face. But anyway, put them in the chat, because it will be really, really interesting to hear from you. And of course, you can also tweet using the hashtag #reframingmuseums, because this conversation isn't just about what's happening in this virtual room, but happening in the broader world. And I should say that there's a science actually behind this, because they say that if you make a pledge, especially a public pledge, you're much more likely to follow up on that commitment. So I'm really interested if there's anything that you feel inspired by this discussion in terms of you wanting to make a difference and behaving and thinking and speaking differently. So we're now going to kick off our next part of the discussion, which is really pulling some of the threads that we started to bring in to talk about different aspects of museums, the art, the curators and staff, the audiences, and indeed the very intentions of museums on this journey to become more diverse and inclusive, and not forgetting, as Kaywin, you were reminding us so importantly earlier, that we're talking about individuals and the pandemic, which has exposed these enormous inequalities and inequality of the way that we have all experienced COVID-19. But to kick us off, we're looking at the artwork itself. And I wanted to first go to you, Laurence Dakkar, and your role. I know the role in your Louvre Abu Dhabi, the challenging exploration and the connections between culture and civilization. And you talked about the decentered gaze. What do you think is the ways that these challenges can be dealt with most effectively? We're talking about the artwork.
Yeah, there are many ways of dealing with it. It's first, I mean, it's listening also to the audience. I think it's very important to really be able to listen to the positive and the negative things they have to say about museum, and especially about large institutions like Orsay, the Louvre, or Versailles, or whatever. You know, I'm sorry for French point of view, but that's very important. But there's also the reality of our collections also, which is an important thing. You cannot change, you know, from scratch the reality of an historical collection. So you have to work on new ways of displaying it or putting it into context. And this is actually done by a lot of museums right now. And we are in Orsay and Orangerie working on new displays of our collection, which will open new vision, new interpretations of our collection.
So how do you display them in a way that is most challenging? What have you found, Laurence?
Well, I think that the question of a context, it's always something that, you know, we can come back to, because you cannot understand, for instance, a collection like the Orsay collection is a 19th century collection. So it means that there's a certain historical background to it, which is the Industrial Revolution, but also the height of the colonial empire for France, and not only for France. And this, of course, has connection to the artistic world, and of course, somehow you will find many connections, you know, within this historical and intellectual context. For instance, we will open in a few days, when we reopen, an exhibition dedicated called The Origins of the World, the Invention of Nature in 19th Century, which is an exhibition which we connect the history of science and history of art with Darwin and the evolution at the center of it, to make, you know, things, to see how you can shift again the point of view and give a richer approach, a more diverse approach, where people with different backgrounds, you know, can find something interesting, a way to get inside, you know, the collection of the exhibition and find something and feel at ease with it. You know, that's very important, because the problem is to break down barriers also for us. You know, we are temples of art. I mean, but Orsay is a former railway station, so it's a bit different. But anyway, this is a very imposing building at the center of Paris. This is not a royal palace, but still, I mean, it's a Beaux-Arts railway station, basically. So you have to break down barriers in order to make people from all different backgrounds be able to find something for themselves in the collection. And I really keep my time, you know, repeating to my team, you know, we have gold in our hands when we think about it, because the diversity of the possible interpretations of our collection, in a negative or in a positive way, that's not the point, you know, but the possibilities of interpretations are just numerous, you know, and you can find always new ways of telling a story, and you can tell the story in a very different way if you want to. So that's that's
absolutely fascinating. And I know, Adriano, in your museum, you've done some really interesting and radical, bold juxtapositions of different pieces of work, of oil paintings and of Punjabi fabrics. And indeed, you've actually displayed some of your work using these crystal frames, which was completely see-through, a more transparent way to display the museums in the very center of your museums, to display the artwork. It would be great if you'd share some of your solutions.
Right, thank you. I think it's easy. We are a museum that have artifacts and artworks from antiquity to the contemporary, no? And just actually responding to what Laurence was saying, it's much more accessible to decolonize the contemporary, no? The contemporary or even the late 20th century or the 20th century, bringing women artists, bringing indigenous artists, bringing Afro-Atlantic, Afro-Brazilian artists into the collection. But when you get to the 19th century, when you get to the 18th century, to the 17th century, 16th century, it becomes even more difficult. No? We have found a quite interesting, I should say, production coming out of Peru, which is from Cusco, the Cusco School, artists working, indigenous artists working through the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, blending traditions, indigenous traditions with Catholic imagery. So that's one topic that we tried to develop and to bring into the collection. But we also felt that it was quite challenging if you have a chronological organization of your collection display. It's still quite challenging to decolonize all those sort of heavily white Eurocentric narratives of art history. So what we've been doing little by little, in fact, is bringing certain contemporary artists up until now, only women artists have been sort of invited to do that in different contexts over the years, to actually install work in connection to other period realms. So within the 16th century, within the 17th century, within the 18th century, you could maybe challenge that narrative a little bit more with the placement, with the juxtaposition of a contemporary artwork made in dialogue with that. So that's one opportunity we've thought could be possible. But of course, within temporary exhibitions, it's much easier. I think the collection display becomes really quite a challenge if you have these broad sort of historical collections, very much grounded in the tradition of European art as we have.
And of course, it's not just artists. I was very taken, Kaywin, that you said in a speech somewhere about the importance of a name, the memory of a name, a signifier of a life mattered. And I saw, Laurence, in the piece that you chose, because of course it was all about the models named. And you celebrated an Australian museum, Kaywin, which renamed works rather than by an unknown artist to a once known artist. And I thought about the enormous power of that reframe. And of course, the symposium is all about reframing, Kaywin. You're on mute.
Thank you, Emily. You've done your research. Yes, one of the initiatives, in fact, that we're doing here at the gallery is we have the Shaw Memorial, which was created to honor Shaw and after the Civil War, and yet it includes the 54th Regiment, the Massachusetts Regiment of African-American soldiers. And yet it's even called the Shaw Memorial, but there's no reference to all of the soldiers. So we're working now on a reinstallation that will include the names of the soldiers, which we've done a lot of research in the archives. And so just to constantly keep that focus of remembering names.
That's really beautiful. And Manal, you want to come in? And please, by the way, any of you guys, if you want to come in a moment, just put your hand up and let's make it interactive.
I just had some thoughts on different things that were just said. I feel sometimes really conflicted, I think, or worried because there's so much work to do in this area. There's so many different areas, levels of inclusiveness that say that we need to think about whether it's abled and disabled, gender, ethnic origins, faiths, etc. And I mean, it goes on. And I think, when I look at what we've been doing, for example, in the Sharjah museums, there's some, specific initiatives that have been taken. So for example, working for over 10 years in accessibility and really making our museums accessible, in particular to people with hearing impairment, for the blind, sign language training, et cetera, which is a big deal because a lot of places in this part of the world do not do that. And so we've worked heavily in that area. We've also worked, for example, in working, with other organizations like Dr. Salah mentioned, the Africa Institute. We partnered with them on a recent exhibition, and that really gave us, again, a really interesting look into other types of ways of representation. And then you have the Barjeel collection, which we're housing, on a long-term loan at the moment, and they have recently made their exhibition that's shown 50-50 gender balanced, for example. So these are all great different things we can do. But I think that what I'm saying about the part of me that is nervous is that it never seems to be enough. There's always the public who say, well, you can do this and you could do that, and what about this? But I feel that, we're trying our best to do what we can in different areas. And I think it's always a difficult situation where you're thinking what to prioritize, how to work on something long-term, what are some short-term things you can do right away that can make a difference. But it's not as easy as it looks. It's not a checklist. And actually, I think Adriano mentioned that earlier. It's a process, and it's a very long-term process. It's not something you can say, I've diversified a board, I've diversified the programs, I've got different types of curators, and then I'm good. It's a much more complex situation. And of course, it's very geographically based. So in our country, we might have particular areas of inclusiveness that need focus that are different than maybe somewhere else. So I think it is also very specific to where you are, who your community is, and how you hope to try to affect change, step by step.
And I'm also just reading in the chat that somebody talked about the local players who are having to cope with so many challenges around COVID. It's not just the big players. But I wanted to ask you, Salah, a question. You're so full of optimism in a way about the massive changes that need to be made. And at the same time, a lot of the institutions and the collections in the institutions are not diverse. They are reflective of a very different age when they were collected. What are we to do with them? I mean, we can create interesting juxtapositions and bold pairings, but we can interpret them in different ways. But what are some of your solutions, Salah?
For me, it always comes from my experience as somebody who's traveled both the academy, but also curating at some point. But let me just, in relation to this question, respond to two questions in the question and answer chat here. One of them talked about how it's not only about Blacks, but it's also about other minorities and other marginalized groups, Latino, Native American, Indians, and so forth. Of course, I couldn't agree more, but sometimes these kind of responses to a question like that becomes like the response to the Black Lives Matter, which is say all lives matter. The only reason of my emphasis, or some people emphasis on Blackness, is because it's at the bottom of all of these, but one of the great of all of these hierarchies, especially in the context of the US. And of course, issues differ from one area or another. And it seems to be most of the question now we're dealing with, and even the representation, with the exception of one or two people in the panel, are mostly from a Western background, Euro-American context. So the questions are much more related to that. But one of the greatest accomplishment of the Black intellectual tradition is the issue of intersectionality. That brings all of these together. But of course, pay attention to the context itself. So for me, if I want to respond to your question directly, I think the challenge is at the ideological and paradigmatic level of art history, okay? Because no matter how this museum responded to the latest, events and suddenly felt almost naked in front of all of these facts, whether it's reports earlier by the Mellon Foundation or what is it in response to this protest, and looking at the history of exhibition, looking at the history of their collections. But of course, if we take this to the context, let's say, of Sharjah, that I'm familiar with, one thing that you'll find that is actually majority women are in these museums. The question they face are totally different. I mean, the issue, I'm not saying the issue of gender is wrong, but here's Manal, and most of these foundations are run by very capable women who actually are aware of all of these issues. I think the solution sometimes to many of these things is the challenges that comes from the global south. And if I'll be more specific, is that places like the Sharjah Art Foundation, for example, the biennial, which is global from the beginning, it challenges nowadays the premises and the work of these institutions like the Venice Biennial, Documenta, and others that existed for so many years. I'm hopeful because I feel the field has changed, and I see this through my own students. That is now they're moving towards a much more global model of art history and comparativism. And I think that will help creating a new generations, and I see this already, even though museums are now scrambling to hire blacks, but they are still not thinking about what really brought them into this kind of problem from the beginning, which is the coloniality of power, which is issues that places like the US, Australia, South Africa face as former or current still settler colonial states, and also fragments of Europe. Read the challenge, even the challenges around the object themselves. In South Africa, for example, on a visit earlier in the 90s, I saw, for example, that for the first time, South Africa started looking at ancient rock or cave paintings that existed there probably from, early, when humanity started walking. But it was suppressed for a reason, because it challenges the issue of the land, because all settler colonial, type of colonialism is always dependent on the fantasy of a barren land that they are the one who are started to fertilize it. So that goes into all of this. So for me, the biggest challenge at that, and the hope too, is for challenging the very paradigms. Now, museums really have to take the issue of reparations seriously, which I wish we could have time for it, because that's the real challenge on the global level for Western museums, is that how is France going to deal with this issue? Is it with this Macron piece that's actually a report that was commissioned and is from the beginning has a limitation to its charge? And even though the report has been really great, but the report has its limitation because it reports to a president. It's not a negotiation that happened between institutions. David Adjaye just released a design of an interesting museum that is in Benin, within Nigeria, the capital of the Benin Kingdom. And the idea is to really prepare this museum, because one of the biggest problems with Western museums is that they always say, well, it's better for these things to be in our collection than going to Africa, because they will be lost or they'll be stolen. There is no museums and so forth. So now there is a consciousness and a deliberate effort to say, okay, we are challenging you on the issue of Benin work, and now we're preparing the ground for it. Although, if I may just conclude by saying, the onus is on these Western museums because of their colonial history and those countries, is that it's not a matter of using a fancy word like restitution. It's about reparation. Do not make excuses that those countries don't have museums. Help them put it. Do a Marshall Plan as you can do it, as you've done with Berlin after the World War II, or as you've done with Ireland with the Celtic Tiger issue, or whatever that's known as.
You're raising some very provocative, fascinating topics and ideas around power, fundamentally, and the globalization of objects and of decision makings. And I'm wondering, Amar Saraswat, from your perspective from India, and I'm particularly thinking about how museums can change to engage a diverse audience, diverse in age as well as diverse in background. And you talked earlier about the village life. What are your thoughts? Or is it that you want a sort of thought about museums which is far, far broader, judging from some of the work that you've been doing?
Thanks, Emily. I just want to add to what Saleh was saying. He was talking about paradigm shift. So when I was talking about the South African analogy of all of us, when we talk about inclusion in museums, it's about all of us, but how? That's what Manal was raising too. So those fundamental museological questions have not really been addressed, because 99% of museums still deal with, us and them, self and other, and the binary, endures. And, as Kevin was talking about, people who lost their jobs, they're mostly colored people and blacks and so on. What about the associated tourism industry, where 90% of the people are in the informal sector? But what has really happened is the pandemic has brought to the forefront this kind of gross inequity within the museum system, that people were underpaid, they were temporary employment. All these things have come to the front finally. For too long, people have been damn politically correct, I still remember when Excellence in Equity, the policy document in American Association of Museums, was launched. In Baltimore, Kimberly Camp was quite a well-known artist from the US. She said, look, typically what happens is the museum director comes, listens to what people have got to say about diversity, comes back next year, the third year is actually presenting a paper without actually doing anything. This kind of co-optation of discourse has gone on for too long. I've seen it in many parts of the world. And where there's something systematic, where there's something really transformative coming up, museums choose to ignore it, like the ICOM Cultural Diversity Charter, which took years to negotiate among all the countries of the world of the International Council of Museums. It's adopted in Shanghai. I mean, it's a document that, all the countries took ownership, but most museums ignore it because then they got to do something about it. And
Can Mr. Amaswar, it's also another thing. They don't want to recognize they failed. They don't want to recognize that it takes vulnerability, it takes strength, really, as an institution to change these, to change what's been done wrong, and to recognize the grievances of people that have been, as Dr. Salah said, put down in the lowest of the hierarchies of all these different inequalities. And I think that's...
So getting back to what Emily asked, what's happened in India is a lot of people who are underpaid, working as janitors, cleaners, temporary staff, including tribal people, Aboriginal people, all on temporary jobs. With the pandemic, they lost their jobs and they went back to their villages because they still have their families, they still have their base. That's where the resilience question comes in, and now the question is, I can say that, the majority of people that I talk to from Mumbai who work in museums, their first complaint is, all these people are gone, I don't have a maid to clean the house. I don't have somebody to cook. I don't have my driver. I have to do everything myself. These are the majority of museum curators and directors complaining about it. And I think that fundamentally we need to rethink, where we are going and the kind of inequities that are there, the kind of climate crisis situation that we have to face. And I think it's time to reflect, be reflexive, and do something about it. And I'd like to finish off, Emily, by quoting Arundhati Roy, the pandemic as a portal, her article, amazing, in Financial Times. She says that, she refers to all the things, inequities we are talking about, and she says that the pandemic is a portal. We can go through it, drag all our practices, our legacies through it, or we can shed them and try to, as Salah was talking about, a paradigm shift. And I think, are we ready for it? Do museums have capacity for it? In my opinion, majority of museums don't have the capacity to change.
It's a big challenge that you're posing there, Amaswar, and looking not just at museums as collections of artifacts, but as institutions which exist in a context, in a societal context. And I know, Laurence de Carle, you've got to run off, but as somebody who is in charge of two enormous, big, influential institutions in France, how do you respond to the challenge which Salah and Amaswar have thrown to you?
The answer is that we are public institutions. We belong to the state, we belong to the nation, we belong to the people of France. We're not a private institution.
But France is multicultural, multilingual.
Yeah. And our mission is to share, actually, to make things accessible and to share. this is, I am sorry about this very French approach also, but this is really what the French Revolution was about, is transforming a royal collection into a national collection. And when I say national, it's public. It belongs again to the nation, to the people. It belongs to everyone. I mean, that's reality. So, I mean, it's really at the heart of our mission. I am a civil servant, you know. I took a special exam to become a curator. In France is how things are done, you know. And and a lot of my staff are public servants, you know, and they are paid by the staff, because in France, we still believe that culture is something extremely important for the benefit of all, you know, and that this is part of our education system also. So, you know, the thing with this crisis and many other questions that are really important right now, especially in France, is that you have to stick to the core of our mission. We have to go to make things relevant again and not make, you know, we're not a touristic institution. It's not that I am a tourist from time to time, so there's no problem with that. But we have a higher mission. This mission is about sharing, is about education, is about opening eyes and hearts. And that's, you know, that's a pretty noble mission. And it's exactly what we want to stick to right now, is to make things again relevant for those large institutions, and maybe coming back to what was at the funding of those institutions at first, you know, which was really about a certain generosity and something closely linked to education and opening minds also, which I think is very, very important right now.
I mean, Laurence, it was about opening minds, and there was a generosity of spirit of giving this extraordinary cultural richness for the public in France. But at the same time, it was also an extraordinary time in context. It was a time, as you were saying earlier, when France had lots of colonies, in which France saw a big hierarchy between people of different races. And how do you manage to put those?
Don't get me wrong. I'm really sticking to the late 18th century, which is very, very important, because this is where things are shifted differently, you know, from a private interest to a public interest. That's very, I mean, this for us, it's a really the basis, you know, of our institutions. Of course, you're right with the colonial context of the 19th century, but let's stick to this idea that otherwise there's no point in creating a museum. There's no point, you know. This is an artificial creation. This is something of a mind, you know. This took centuries in Europe to come to a private collection, to something that is public and something that tells a narrative, you know, certain narrative that can be corrected, that should be more open, more diverse and everything. But, you know, what is a museum? A museum is a collection. Museum is a collection in a certain place, in a certain context. You cannot change this. You can change, of course, the way you display it, the narrative. But the beauty of it is its artificiality also, you see? That's a pretty complex thing, because, you know, we all have in our museums, and I'm not really, I mean, for the 19th century, most of the works that we display in Orsay have been made for the museum. They have been created, especially.
Laurence, I realize where you're coming from. I've been to your museum many times. I love it, but may I say that no culture is static. Every culture is dynamic. France's or any other country, it's not just France. You know, the population is dynamic, is changing, and we need to diversify our collections so that we are relevant, to use your word. So that's what I'm getting at. It's not, our museum's dynamic enough. If you're absolutely right, they've got to be mission driven. But if they're mission driven and not relevant, then the mission has to be rethought. And if they're relevant, then they've got to reflect the society, like you said, contemporary. So that's all. I mean, that's what inclusion is all about, is being relevant.
But we are precisely working on this every day in Orsay and Orangerie, you know. I think our programmings of exhibition, our display, I mean, you know, you should come back to Orsay maybe one day.
Thank you so much. And I want to come to you, one second, I want to come to you, Manal, but I just wanted to bring in one of our audience members, Francesca Bacci, because they say that as a university professor, I'm committed to decolonize my curriculum and do the labor of rewriting my courses to include the work of a range of artists, of BIPOC artists, particularly women. And we've talked a lot more about racial inequalities than gender, but that discrimination is also very important. And definitely we must remind ourselves in this discussion. And I want to hear from you, Kewin, but first, Manal, you wanted to come in.
Oh, I just wanted to make a few remarks, just because I understand that it's frustrating for people, I think, in an audience or otherwise, to hear people like us talk about, wanting that we should and we are listening to our audiences, etc. But how do you actually listen? I think that is the problem that relates to what Amiswar was saying and Dr. Salah, which is, if you're an institution and your mode of listening is listening to art critics, for example, or listening to, what your board is telling you, but your board and your art critics are from a specific class, they have a specific demographic, pretty much, majority, then you're not really listening to that, to the real public that's out there, to those marginalized groups. That how are you actually interacting with those people? It's that shift in the core that makes up the museum that has to happen, because it's so easy, like I said, for us to change, to add a diversity person on board, officer, or to put in an exhibition that focuses on China this year. But to me, that's not what we're talking about. I think we're really talking about fundamentally uprooting what some of these institutions are based on, really uprooting the people who are making those decisions and who we are listening to. And I'll be honest and tell you, in my own organization, when we go about thinking of a program, or even when we thought about a marketing, strategy, I'll ask the ladies, who work for me. In this case, they're all women in my department. And I said to them, who came up with this idea? And they go, well, we did, and we all agreed that this is the best way forward. And I said, well, don't you think you should ask other people, other genders, people from different backgrounds? Maybe they won't understand the message you're trying to portray, because you're all pretty much the same in terms of where you come from and your access to this or that. And this is extremely important when you're in a country where you have different languages being spoken, definitely different nationalities and life experience. And I think a simple thing of take that out to other people, whether it's in the organization or outside the organization, just get another perspective, get multiple perspectives, is a small way that you can actually effectively start to change the way you view what you think is, oh, that's an obvious answer to this, or that sounds like a great plan. But it's actually, it's very rooted in how you think about things. And it's, these things over time really shift. Any object over time will change depending on how you see it in the perspective of time and place and space, So I think that's something that we need to really talk about, rather than just saying we're doing things by listening or changing programming.
I think that's a fascinating question, because we all talk about listening, but actually, how do you do it? And to relate to Salah's point earlier, it is about power. Who has the power to be in the room, and who has the power to have their voice heard? And I'm also interested in hearing the voices, of course, of our audience. And if you want to come and actually take part and hear your voice, please just put a yes after your comment in capitals, so we know to bring you in to the conversation. But I wanted to bring in you now, Kewin, momentarily, because I know you were nodding what Manal was saying earlier, and that's something I know, bringing in different voices and including and reaching out to a whole range of different audiences is really fundamental and important to you, Kewin.
Yes, thank you, Emily. And I have to say how much I'm enjoying hearing from my colleagues on the screen. This is a great discussion that I think is hitting some very important points. And I have to echo Manal's comments. As probably many of you know, the gallery has recently, and me in particular, been criticized because we were supposed to be hosting an exhibition of a retrospective of the American painter Philip Guston at this moment. And Guston, who is a very important artist, extremely influential, and absolutely deserves a retrospective. The challenge with the material is that Guston, who was Jewish and very opposed to the Ku Klux Klan, particularly in the 70s, did a series of paintings where he used imagery from the Klan as a kind of alter ego. He used it as a way to really ask people to step up to examine evil in themselves. So his intentions were very much in line with what we might call anti-racism today. However, he was a white artist who painted in a different time in America. And we decided at the National Gallery, as the other museums on the tour did separately, that we weren't ready to show the work, and that we needed to actually take the time to slow down and do a lot of listening to our community. And also, I've been heavily criticized for saying that we need to listen to our security guards. Here at the National Gallery, currently, our entire curatorial team is white, and 85% of our security guards are African American. And we would be asking them to stand in front of these Klan pictures for 8 hours every day. And I decided we needed to pause. We are still going to do the exhibition. We're going to do it in 2023, but we need to have time for conversations. And a point that I try to make is that you cannot have those difficult conversations by Zoom. You really need to be with people in a room, hearing their experiences. And you simply can't do that during a pandemic. And so we decided to pause. I find it quite interesting that it's definitely been the art critics in the art world that have been so upset by this. They've been offended. And I think there's also misogyny. They're offended that a woman is saying we need to slow down and examine these works and think about the point of reception, because we know the point of creation. We have a good sense of Guston's great intentions. He really meant to challenge society. But we can't disown the fact that people, 21st century Americans, particularly African Americans who have had a particular experience living as a Black person in the United States, have their own point of view and their own reception to the work. And I'll just conclude by saying it is this moment to think about expertise. And, what I have been told consistently, mostly by white men, is you need to tell people what to think. Just tell them what Guston's thoughts were. And, my response is that they also come from their own lived expertise. And our field has valued only curatorial and scholarly expertise, which remains of greatest importance and the bedrock of our work. It's not an either or, it's an and. And we also want to recognize the lived experience and expertise of our visitors who come. It's about recognizing the intelligence and dignity of the people who we serve.
And how do you do that? How do you balance recognizing the expertise and deep knowledge of your curators and of the art historians alongside the lived experience in a way that's not just tokenistic? I mean, I don't know, Adriano, what do you do? What are your thoughts on that? And Amaraswa, interested in your thoughts too.
Oh, Emily, Dr. Salah has been wanting to comment for a while.
Okay. Go on, Dr. Salah. Thank you. Manal.
My question is actually just building on what Amaraswa and Manal said. It's just, especially in the context of the French, I was intrigued by the answer from Laurence regarding the museum, that it has a specific mission and it's kind of engendered by the early ideals of the French Revolution. The question that I have is that it's great to have somebody like Glenn Ligon to come to do the show or a show about the Black models in French or European painting. The challenge that I think Manal and others is, how do you really think about the Banyalou? How do you think about the Algerians, the French, the Senegalese, and other West African Muslim in the context of what's happening today to France? How do you bring them into because that's the challenge. The French Revolution happened in the context of when France was still engaged in slavery. Here comes at that time came the Haitian Revolution, challenge all the ideals of modernity, of liberty, equality, and all of that to say, we are humans too. So I think for me, how do you really respond to what's happening in those underprivileged minority areas who are actually form a great majority within the urban centers of France? How do you bring them to an elite museum like the d'Orsay?
Sorry, one of the answers, it's not the only one, but one of the answers is to work with the national education system. We are very much engaged in that in different levels. I mean, from younger age to students level, in order to reach out to those communities through our school programs, because I mean, the Orsay collection is very much linked, to this and to the birth of the Republic also, the end of the 18th century and all the story of the 19th century. So we do have a lot of reach out, and a lot of reach out also in the suburbs around Paris, where we work with associations, and we do have a lot of involvement. I mean, in those actions. I mean, we're very present, and we're famous for that, actually. So it's not. I mean, it's one of the answers. It's not the only one, because I mean, it's really about creating a sort of common ground, for this very fractured and difficult history, of the colonial France, and how you can make a community again, looking at things that, are terrible, but also trying to see through what an art collection can bring, which is something very special, because you're dealing with artistic expression, you're dealing with some very important artists and important, works of art. Also, how art can at one point bring somehow people together, and see how you can work on these common grounds and sharing something that is something that is, simply important, beautiful, and worth sharing, definitely, and that sticks to our history also. That is relevant to our common history. It is a pretty tough thing, and it's not an easy thing, and it's why I want to emphasize education in the coming years. We will create an education center in Orsay, which is the first time ever that a national museum does that, and it's completely dedicated to this work, especially with the school system around the collections of our museum. So I do believe that one of the key is through education. Really.
It's interesting you talk about education as a solution on how art can ask these difficult questions and bring a community together. And I'm wondering if other people have solutions on how it can actually do this in practice, rather than it's so hard, as you were saying, Laurence, to actually find practical ways of doing this. And I'm wondering if any of you guys have thoughts on how this can be actualized. And Laurence, by the way, if you have to run off, please feel free.
I'm sorry. I have an important meeting at the Minister of Culture, trying to reopen the museum, and to be able to welcome people, which is a top priority right now. Thank you all. It was very nice talking with you.
You got a chance to answer, Saleh. So thanks, Laurence. Good luck to you.
Thank you.
I think,
You're
Emily,
putting your hand up there. We're looking for practical ways to use art to bring people together.
Emily, I just wanted to say, in Australia in the 90s, when art museums and museums talked about education for immigrants and Aboriginal people to come into the institutions, we objected very strongly, saying this is systemic racism, because this is like civilizing mission once again all over, to civilize us through education. So our awareness of Western art, hegemonic aesthetic discourse is raised. So what we argued for through national approaches, through policy approaches, is we want to be part of the change. We want to, have our first voice heard and integrated. We want to diversify the senior management of museums. We want to diversify the funding bodies. So we took a very strong line, and the direction came very much from Prime Minister and Cabinet, because politically it was very sensitive, because no political party could win in Australia without the support of immigrants, who constituted more than 40% at that stage, and younger immigrants too. So it's political, it's about power, it's about museums letting go of authority. But education, yes, it's very important, but I'm not into the civilizing mission of education. Treating immigrants, indigenous people, everybody to be educated about art. That's systemic racism.
Yeah, can I say that I agree with that? I think for me, the education part that I would like to emphasize on is using learning as a means to do really two things. One is one of the underlying missions of any museum, which is the scholarly academic research that what Laurence mentioned, she called it about, being a collection. It's all about the collection, but yes, it's how you use that collection to further study and understand the material that you have and how it connects with other people, or how perhaps you can add to that narrative or change that narrative and make it more accurate, for example, through scholarship. So that's one part of education that I think is extremely important and will add to inclusiveness, when people are able to study that material and really add their perspective and their knowledge. But the other part of learning is also bringing objects and I think museums to other marginalized groups outside the museum space, which, for example, in Sharjah, we were starting to do with two different programs. One is with working with inmates at a correctional facility in Sharjah. So we have been, for 2 years now, doing on-site workshops. We've created an exhibition in-house there on the premises. And we have had different programs with them, with their families that they can do, as well as helping them to, it's part of the rehabilitation process for them, but it's more about giving them a chance to understand, who they are in the context of where they are, and really celebrating history and culture in general. But this is a good way to reach people outside of your museum. Another program was going to public schools in rural areas who did not have access to museums. So trying to look at how they can think of the collection and see it, but also look at it in their own way. And for me, it's very powerful to see a young person, 14 years old, to say, I've never been to a museum, I've never heard of Cubism, I've never heard of whatever, but I like it, it's interesting for me. It's not that we want to teach them these things in particular, but for me, it's about getting them critically thinking. It's about instilling a sense of creativity in them, a kind of thirst for knowledge, to learn, to investigate things. That's what I want, rather than, for me, a good experience in museum is not learning a lot of facts per se, but it's about getting your mind moving in a different way. And as you introduced me earlier, it's making you feel uncomfortable about some of the things that you thought you knew, or your own biases that you start to kind of reinvestigate. And that's what I think, good museums and good learning outcomes can be in a museum.
It's fascinating.
Can I make a quick comment? Very quick comment.
Very quick, go on, because I want to bring in a member of the audience, yeah. But go on, Amaraswa.
I think that people always talk about outreach, reaching out, outreach, but they rarely talk about in-reach. I think that there's a dialectic there between in-reach and outreach. And I learned this, why this is so significant, from the network of women who work in museums in UK. There's a wonderful woman called Jasmine Calm, who was working at the British Library. She was a strong advocate that you can't talk about outreach without talking about in-reach.
Thank you. That's a beautiful thought. That is a really good. I'm sorry to interrupt you there, but I'm just aware that our clock is running out, and I'm so super keen, as we want to be inclusive, to bring in a member of the audience. And I hear that Maria Veronica Leon Ventimilla, who's an artist in the UAE, would like to come in and take part in our conversation. There we go. She's popped up on the screen. Maybe we can also see your face, Maria, but if not, we'll just hear your voice. And interested in your perspective as an artist in terms of our discussion and debate, Maria. So can we hear from you, our AV team? Can we allow Maria to speak?
Hello? Hello?
Hi.
How are you? How are you? Please repeat the question for me since the signal broke.
Okay, well, I'm interested in your perspective as an artist. We've been talking about education, making you rethink rather than in-reach, rather than outreach, and really looking at solutions in ways to make museums more diverse and inclusive in the very core of what we do, given the challenges of their histories and their collections. What are your thoughts, Maria, as an artist?
Well, I have to remember that I come from South America in order to remember those chapters of my life, but probably I didn't feel included. And all the way that I have been fighting, and I can consider I made some battles in the name of that inclusion, I cannot complain. So I believe that in these times, we have to dissolve somehow the barriers that for in one or other position we have been putting in our different jobs, artists, museums, and different spaces as institutions. So now we are dissolving, we can say, those old structures, and to talk about inclusion, we have to create as well new practices to bring the organical sense of life to the artistic practice. I mean, we are all these fantastic days discussing about collecting, the protection of the museums and the collections, at the same time living a kind of nostalgia about what we had, what we have been in these times. And I propose performatic actions, creative actions, video actions to give a kind of life to the museums. So yesterday I proposed, why no, in the local different communities, we include different sectors of the society to create in situ artworks, practices that big format, not just for the fact of making big format, but to create an explosion of energies that take us to the next step, which is having the courage to break those structures and looking for something new. I respect enormously all these incredible and respectful digital dialogues. I love them. But at the same time, I wouldn't like that we dissolve ourselves in the miniaturization of our voices and our faces and our souls. Our souls has to go out to take echo forces, natural forces. And I think that in every country, where we are living, we have different cultures that can be included, not exactly for being part of a museum or any specific collection. Our interests are on the table, but let it for a little while, our personal interests in a table in order to create a kind of, let's go to the next chapter, a kind of healthy or healing transformation, a kind of healing revolutionary actions. That's one. I'm very quickly saying art cures. Art cures our anxieties for historically, as you know. So I believe that we have to unify, forgetting our titles for a little while, and to unify our forces to become universal in the place that we are. But alive, not just through the digital. We have to have the courage to create art in multiple spaces and to make public art until then with any material that we can, like a kind of invasive, in the good sense of term, invasion with art in public spaces, calling people that are not precisely in the art community, and it doesn't matter the material, and to create even one piece that will be destroyed at the end of the day. But we have to leave.
That's fantastic, Maria. Thank you so much for that energetic contribution about healing revolutionary actions and about invasive art to get out of the museums into the public space. And the way that you were talking with so much passion and energy and empathy with your audiences. And I wanted to bring in Kaywin because so much of your work, particularly in Minneapolis, was at your empathy center and understanding the role of empathy in the enabling art to reach out to audiences. And I'm wondering what the role is of empathy at this critical transitional time that we're all living through, Kaywin.
Yeah, thank you. always delighted to talk about empathy, something I care about very, very much. And, you know, it has been proven by social scientists that empathy is something that is genetic. We're actually, some of us are born more empathic than others. However, it can also be learned. And so in Minneapolis, we sort of went on this journey to figure out were there ways that we could execute our museum practice to with a specific goal of furthering empathy with audiences, and embarked on this process of really studying what happens in the galleries, and whether it's through interpretation, the types of tours that we did, how we might actually move the dial. And I think it's important to consider that art is really a great vehicle for better understanding of other people. And even the whole concept of empathy in the West really evolved in the late 19th century, and it came out of the idea of art. The idea was that you could sort of feel into a work of art to better understand whether it's the person who made the art or the time period, or even to know yourself better. So I do believe that it's a moment where we need to have more empathy for our visitors, for the people who come across our thresholds, for the people who participate with the museum, as well as the artists who create the work, and that there are deliberate strategies that we can use to actually further empathy. The last thing I'll say is that there's a study that's been done in the United States since 1970, and it's actually proven that Americans have become less empathic. We kind of sense it, but they've been actually able to show through testing of college students in America, we can see a decline. And, you know, at this particular moment, again, just staying on America, where we see so much opposition in our nation, and there's this feeling that if you're for one thing, then you have to be against something else. And we all talk very abstractly about reaching across the aisle, about coming together. And I think museums really have a great role to play in helping that to happen.
That's fascinating. And Adriano, I wanted to bring you in because, of course, Brazil, in some ways, your society echoes that of the US. You've got a very, very divided society. You've got a controversial leader amongst many Brazilians. And I'm wondering how you use art in your museum to bring people together and create that empathy and that deep understanding and the beginning and the openness to listen to people you disagree with, rather than that sort of virtuous signaling about your own position being so much better than the other.
Right. As in the US, we also have a very controversial leader, except the US is sharply divided mostly between two parties, and we have, you know, a number of dozens of parties really, so it's even more sort of divided. But I should say that we are a private museum. We have a wide range of constituents in a board of around 80 people. We really attempt to, I guess, as the National Gallery does, try not to have any type of partisan approach because of that, because of the, you know, the wide range of audience that we have as well. But we do have, as I said, in our mission, we have this definition of the museum as diverse, inclusive, and plural, which really gives us the mandate to develop diverse programs of different sorts. And so we've done year-long programs around, as you mentioned, histories of sexuality, but also feminist histories, women's histories, Afro-Atlantic histories. We're planning indigenous histories as well. So all this is very much part of our mandate, you know? We are also looking at diversity and, you know, not just the program and the collection and the staff.
But how do you actually, you're putting on all these really brave exhibitions, which really bring artwork and juxtapositions, which haven't been brought to the fore. But how do you actually use them to create empathy across difference so that people who feel alienated about these different positions can learn to understand them? What is it that you can do? What are the solutions?
So
here?
I think one area that has become quite important for us, even during the pandemic, is the area of communication. So now we have brought in an assistant curator within the Department of Communication that oversees, social media, for example. We were talking about listening to different voices, and it's interesting that our panel is called Voices of Authority. And I think diversity and plurality also means polyphony. So it's important to have several voices engaging in that sense. We're constantly listening to, and reading comments that come up in social media. We have a group with the assistant curator, the chief curator, and myself that, we're looking at these statements that come across social media and different comments. I think also that, with the diversity of the collection, for example, the large presence of Black artists and Black representations, we see a lot of comments, even in social media, how people actually now come to a museum that was formerly known as a Museum of European Art, only with mostly white characters represented in the paintings and the sculptures. Now they see themselves representing in these different works, and we see their response, again, mostly in social media. So it's important.
Thank you. And Manal, I'll just leave the final word to you in terms of what you feel. And I really appreciate people's honesty in this discussion. I feel that it's been a really honest discussion. So I'm interested in you, Manal, to continue that theme of honesty and transparency in terms of what you can do to bring and forward and move the needle in this space.
Well, first of all, that's a huge burden to leave me as the last person to make a comment. But actually, my mind was kind of pinging as Adriana was speaking, and then something Keiwon talked about, which was empathy, which is like at the heart of inclusion. But anyway, I was just trying to think about what we started off at the beginning about digital presence and the opportunities of all that. I think one of the key things that we will really miss out on, I think, and I'm sure Keiwon would probably agree, is that empathy will be lost if it's not done in a physical space with people. Because you can have all this great content, as Adriana is talking about, all these great programs, but if they were online, you wouldn't have the opportunity to unpack those things, which is what learning people in a museum or with others helps you to do. The empathy gets lost because it's easy to just look at images and see information about who it's made and what's the title or read a caption, but what else can you do after that? That's where the museum essence, I think, plays a big part in how you engage with the work and really make it something different. So I think the digital part we could lose a lot of that, which I think is the most central thing to inclusive programs, right? But that also goes back to the idea again of our museums, how are they looking at themselves in terms of neutrality, or are they making a stand for something? And these are questions about that too. But to answer your question about, you said how, we make a difference. I'm already looking at how I can be bolder, I guess, in my decisions and in articulating ideas that I think when you're a public institution, you might sometimes worry. You say, oh, because I represent the government or certain things, I may not be able to say things a certain way. But I think there's definitely between saying this and saying that, there's a lot of place in between where you can actually start to, bring about change. Whether it's, as you quoted me, I started to write opinion pieces, which talk a lot more about how I see my role or how I see a museum's role, which may not necessarily be there in other instances. It's how I'm challenging my staff to think about things that, they take it as this is how it's done, and I challenge them on that. I don't tell them I have the answer, and many times I don't have the answer, but even if I did, I'd say, how about you think about it differently? I looked at a symposium we're doing at the end of the year. I said, did you think about gender? Did you think about different backgrounds in the speakers? They hadn't thought about that. I said, you need to think about who are these voices you're including? And I think just having that knowledge and them being aware of it, it transmits to other people. So they are things you can do that can be everyday actions, but then they could be major policy changes, you know, in a way a museum functions or collects or anything else. So,
well, I think that is just so fantastic to hear, because the people we have in this room, on our virtual room, and indeed the audiences from the 65 countries, if everyone was that bit more bold in the spaces in between to bring about change, just, you know, think of the possibilities. And I just wanted to sum up one or two quick thoughts that I was scribbling, where there was so much insight from our panelists and indeed from the audience in a little way. And Kewin, you beginning with the importance of kids and the future, the idea of Amaraswa, of representing villages and the unheard voices. And Laurent was talking about the visible invisibility. And Adriano, when you talked about that banner from bringing the outside to inside the museums, and Manal talking about refugee artists. And I loved, Salah, your choice of the piece of work, you know, from the flag, about it being witty and subversive, and the tension between inclusion and exclusion. And of course, you know, all of you have been talking about this unique moment that we have, that when things accelerate and the opportunities from that moment, notwithstanding, Kewin, the enormous suffering that this pandemic has brought to particular parts of our community. Manuel, I like you said the pandemic, which has woken us up. I thought that was very, very powerful. And we've also been talking about, Laurent mentioning listening to the audience. How do we really listen to them? How do we listen to the security guards? How do we listen to people who are not in the museums but need to be in the museum? And Laurent talked about that we've got gold in our hands, the enormous, beautiful artwork, but how do we change and radically make people see things differently, the possibilities of multiple interpretations? Adriano talked about challenging narratives, of juxtapositions. And Manuel, you talked about the strength to change an institution, to recognize the grievances of individuals, and Amaraswa, about workers who went back to their villages, who are no longer either working in museums or indeed serving the people who do work in museums. How do we bring them back into the conversation? And someone spoke about opening eyes and hearts. And then, Manuel, you raised the question, which we didn't really answer, but is an interesting one to leave the audience with, about the challenge of how do you actually listen? And then, Salah, you brought very big challenges to everybody around this table and to the audiences in terms of fundamental questions of power, of Western collections, and of a westernization in terms of education and the dangers of that Amaraswa you had picked up on. And thank you so much, Kewin, for giving us that very concrete example of Philip Guston. It may have been a piece of work that was created with the best possible intentions, but also looking about the way we read a piece of work many decades on, and how we can ensure that we are bringing that diversity of people into the room when we make those very difficult decisions that all of you as curators and as museum leaders need to be making. And I love Maria's explosion of energy and having the courage to create something new. And I'd like to leave that. So a very, very big thank you to our illuminating guests, to Kewin Feldman, to Amaraswa Gala, to Laurence Descartes, Adriano Pedroso, Manal Ataya, and Salah Hassan. But most of all, thank you, the brilliant audience, for your contributions and for what you are yet to do in your lives as people who have a vested interest in the future of museums, whether it's in museums across the world or as students or people who are interested museum goers, and to see what power we collectively can make. Remember, you can share your thoughts that you've had after our discussion using the hashtag #ReframingMuseums. It's been such a pleasure to host, and I'm very grateful to our hosts at the symposium, the Louvre Abu Dhabi and NYU Abu Dhabi, and the extraordinary curator Anaïs Aguerre, who's put everything together. Thank you so, so very much to everyone.
Thank you, Emily. Can we thank you as well for moderating all of us who I think were quite a difficult bunch to get together. So thank you, and to everyone else as well at NYUAD and at Louvre Abu Dhabi. Thank you.
You're welcome.
You still got some chocolate left, Emily?
Yeah, I have. I've eaten about half my chocolate bar, but the other half is shared virtually. So it's pretty good. You saw me nibbling during the conversation, but I had to keep my energy up because there's so many brilliant ideas that were floating around, and I wish we had more time to be able to bring them up and challenging ideas, which I think is so wonderful. I felt that we weren't just all being polite to each other, which I loved.
Thanks very much then. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Lovely to meet you, Adriana. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And Kevin, I've really I've been following your work. Gretchen Jennings is our mutual friend. And nice to see you, because I never saw. Yeah, thank you.
Kevin,
Thanks,
I'd love
everybody.
Sorry, thank you. I'd love to tell you a little anecdote, because you mentioned security guards, Kevin. So when I went to the UK earlier this year in February to see Carl Walker's work at the Tate, I asked the security guard what he thought of the work. And at first I asked him where he was from, etc. And he told me he was from Uganda. And we had a really nice chat about that, because I told him my father had been there and traveled there for business long time ago. But then I asked him, what did you think of the work? And I said, it's really quite painful, because he asked me if I wanted to take a picture with it. He was going to photograph me. I said, I don't think it's appropriate. The work is not one I want to be photographed in front of, because I think that the meaning of it is just, it's horrifying. Whereas other people were taking photos, obviously. And he said to me,
fascinating, Manal. Have you got a quick roundup? Because I've been told we need to finish the conversation. Go on, give us the punchline.
What he said to me was, why I like it, he said, I like the work is because it made me realize that you should change your circumstance into wisdom. And that's what I left with. That quote, I wrote it down.
Brilliant. Changing circumstance into wisdom. Thank you, Manal. I'm going to wrap up here, because I've been told by my technical guys. But thank you all so much, and hope to have an opportunity to connect afterwards. All the very best. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.